Words written centuries ago still shape the world you live in today. We are about to uncover 30 medieval instructions whose creators are long forgotten, yet their blueprints for building, healing, and governing have refused to fade away. By the end of this journey, you will understand the secret ingredients that make an idea truly immortal. How could a simple set of rules for monks become the bedrock of Western civilization? What forgotten medical text guided doctors for over 400 years? These are whispers from the past that never fell silent. What do you believe gives an idea the power to outlive its creator? In an age before the printing press, every written word was a treasure. Knowledge was not something you could download or find in a library down the street. It was a physical, fragile thing, often existing as a single copy in a candlelit room. The hum of the medieval world was the quiet scratch of a quill on parchment. Scribes working for countless hours in monastery scriptoria were not merely copying text, they were building arks. Each manuscript was a vessel designed to carry an idea through the turbulent seas of time, a deliberate attempt to send a message into a future they would never see. This was the ultimate act of hope, a defiance of oblivion itself. These monastic communities became the unexpected guardians of civilization itself. While their primary mission was spiritual, their scriptoria became the de facto libraries, data centers, and universities of the era. They preserved the Bible and the works of saints, yes, but they also meticulously copied practical, everyday instructions. A farmer's guide to crop rotation, a healer's recipe for a salve, a king's decree on property law, all were given the same careful attention as a book of Psalms. This created a fragile but resilient chain of custody for human knowledge. It was a system that survived because of its dedication, allowing crucial ideas to pass from one generation to the next, through plagues, famines, and the fall of kingdoms. Without this quiet, relentless work of preservation in those hallowed halls, the 30 instructions we are about to explore would have been lost to the dust, their creators truly forgotten. The stage was set for immortality by the hands of countless, nameless scribes. But what exactly are we looking for on this journey? An instruction that outlived its creator is far more than a faded note or a list of old rules. It is a functional idea, a piece of operational knowledge that was put into practice again and again, long after the person who first wrote it down was gone. Think of it not as a relic in a museum case, but as an active blueprint. These were the formulas that continued to build cities, the medical texts that continued to heal the sick, and the legal codes that continued to govern societies, all while the names of their original authors were erased by time. Their power lies in a special combination of inherent utility and sheer adaptability. They were so well designed, so fundamentally useful, that they could be cleanly lifted from their original context and planted into new eras where they would take root and flourish once more. This is the defining trait you will see echoed in every one of our 30 examples. And to truly understand this quality, we begin with a set of rules that did not just organize a community, but ended up shaping the very mind of the Western world. Our first instruction emerged from the wreckage of a fallen empire. As Roman order crumbled into memory, a young man named Benedict retreated to a cave, seeking solitude from a world he saw as corrupt and disordered. But his retreat was not an escape. It was the beginning of a radical experiment in building a new kind of community from the ground up. What he created in that Italian wilderness was not just a spiritual retreat, but a complete survival manual for the human spirit in a dark age. He called it simply the Rule. This was not a vague set of suggestions. It was a precise, practical constitution for daily life, meticulously outlining everything from the 7 daily prayer services to the exact amount of bread and wine for each monk. It dictated the schedule for manual labor, the importance of reading and study, and even how to humbly correct a brother who had erred. The genius of Benedict's rule was its profound understanding of human nature. He built his entire system on 3 pillars: stability, obedience, and a balance between prayer and work. Stability meant a monk pledged to remain with his community for life, turning the monastery into a permanent home, not a temporary shelter. Obedience was not about blind submission, but about surrendering one's own will for the greater harmony of the whole. And that balance between the spiritual work of prayer and the physical work of labor is what made the entire system economically self-sufficient and psychologically sustainable. These monasteries became fortified islands of order in a sea of chaos. They were not just places of prayer, they were agricultural centers, hospitals, schools, and libraries. The rule provided the organizational DNA that allowed these communities to replicate themselves across Europe, from Ireland to the frontiers of Poland. For over 1,500 years, this single text has guided countless lives. Its principles of structured routine, communal responsibility, and balanced labor resonate in modern organizational theory and even in our own search for a purposeful life. A spiritual guide for a handful of monks became the unexpected blueprint for rebuilding a civilization. Benedict's rule brought order to the monastery, but how do you impose order on an entire continent? That was the monumental challenge facing Charlemagne. His empire stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into Germany and south to Italy, a vast and fractured collection of different peoples, languages, and local laws. Holding this mosaic together required more than military might. It demanded a revolutionary system of administration. His solution was a flood of detailed instructions known as the Capitularies. These were not grand philosophical statements. They were intensely practical decrees dispatched by royal messengers to every corner of his realm. Imagine a single, central authority issuing directives on everything from the proper weight of a silver coin to the legal procedures for a murder trial, from how to organize a local militia to the urgent need for priests to establish schools. This was one of history's first attempts at large-scale, standardized governance. The instructions were carried by his trusted agents, the missi dominici, who were sent out in pairs, a bishop and a noble, to ensure the emperor's word was not just heard but enacted. They were the physical embodiment of the law, auditing local counts, hearing grievances, and making the vast, abstract idea of an empire feel real to a farmer in a distant village. Yet, for all its ambition, Charlemagne's empire did not long survive him. It was divided among his grandsons and slowly fragmented into the feudal tapestry of knights and castles we recognize today. But the Capitularies did not vanish with the empire that created them. These administrative instructions proved to be astonishingly resilient. They became the foundational texts for the emerging feudal states, the basic blueprint for law and governance that local lords and new kings adapted for their own use. The procedures for raising an army, the templates for legal charters, the very concept of a written administrative order, all these ideas seeped into the bedrock of European society. The empire was temporary, but its operating system became permanent, a set of governmental instructions that truly outlived its legendary creator. While Charlemagne's Capitularies organized an empire with words, another set of instructions from his era sought to build a perfect world in miniature. Tucked away in a monastic library for over 1,000 years lies a single, massive sheet of parchment, known as the Plan of St. Gall. This is not the blueprint for a building that was constructed. It is something far more powerful, the blueprint for an idea. Created around the year 820, this intricate drawing represents the ultimate medieval instruction for a self-contained community. Every structure is meticulously placed. A grand basilica anchors the complex, flanked by two courtyards. One side houses the scriptorium and library, the heart of knowledge. The other contains the dormitory, refectory, and kitchen, the engine of daily life. Beyond these lie a hospital, a school for novices, guest houses for pilgrims, and an entire industrial zone with workshops for craftsmen. There are stables, barns, and sprawling gardens divided for vegetables, herbs, and even a cemetery orchard. And yes, there is a brewery and a bakery, because a community needs both bread and beer to survive. This was a vision of total order, a world behind walls where every human need, from the spiritual to the utterly mundane, was provided for in a harmonious, logical layout. The anonymous architect did not just draw walls and roofs, he designed a way of life. The plan's true genius was its adaptability. It was a master template, a kit of parts that could be adjusted to fit a hillside in Switzerland or a river valley in France. For centuries, monastic founders and builders studied this single parchment. They copied its layout, its proportions, and its revolutionary concept of functional zoning. The church here, the living quarters there, the noisy workshops safely downwind. This spatial logic did not just shape monasteries, it became the underlying grammar for medieval towns that grew up around them. A bustling market square, a central church, distinct quarters for different trades, these urban patterns can trace their conceptual roots back to this idealized drawing. The plan of St. Gall is a profound lesson in legacy. Its creator is utterly unknown, his name erased by time, yet his vision, captured in ink and vellum, escaped the page to physically sculpt the landscape of Europe. It proves that the most enduring instructions are not always for governing people or building empires, but for constructing the very spaces where life, learning, and community can flourish for generations. While the plan of St. Gall organized life within walls, another set of instructions was dedicated to sustaining life beyond them. The Geoponica speaks from the sun-baked fields of the Byzantine Empire, a massive collection of agricultural wisdom compiled in the 10th century. This was not the work of a single mind, but a grand anthology, gathering the best practices from Roman and Greek farming texts that might otherwise have been lost. It was a farmer's encyclopedia, a practical manual for survival in a challenging world. Its pages offered meticulous guidance on every aspect of rural life. A vintner could learn the precise methods for cultivating the sweetest grapes. An olive grower found instructions for pressing the finest oil. Shepherds discovered better techniques for animal husbandry, while every farmer learned recipes for homemade concoctions to ward off blight and insects. This was evidence-based advice tested over generations, written not for scholars but for the hands that worked the soil. The true power of the Geoponica was its portability. When the Byzantine Empire itself eventually fell, this book did not disappear with its political creators. Its knowledge was far too valuable to be confined by borders or the fate of empires. Manuscripts were translated into Armenian and Arabic, traveling across the Mediterranean. The practical wisdom within, on how to rotate crops for maximum yield or how to predict the weather by observing the sky, became a common inheritance for farmers from Italy to the Middle East. For hundreds of years, it was a foundational text, its instructions putting food on tables and wine in cups for generations who never knew the names of the original contributors. It stands as a quiet testament to a simple, universal truth that the most vital instructions are often the ones that teach us how to feed each other. But feeding the body was only one part of the medieval struggle for survival. healing it was another, and in this realm, a different kind of instruction emerged from a sun-drenched corner of Italy. The port city of Salerno became a crucible of medical knowledge, a place where Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Jewish learning converged. Here, at the first great medical school in Europe, a collection of writings appeared that would change the course of women's healthcare. These texts were attributed to a figure named Trotula, a woman healer whose very existence has been debated for centuries. Whether she was a single brilliant physician or a name representing the collective wisdom of many female practitioners, the work that bore her name was revolutionary. The Trotula ensemble did not shy away from topics that were often considered taboo. It provided detailed instructions for childbirth, for diagnosing diseases specific to women, and for a range of surgical procedures. It even included cosmetic recipes, not as mere vanity, but as practical knowledge for maintaining health and social standing. This was a remarkably progressive view, treating women's bodies and their ailments as a legitimate, complex field of study worthy of written instruction. The true power of these texts was their enduring utility. For over 400 years, the Trotula was the primary medical reference for women's health across Europe. A physician in England or a midwife in France would consult its pages for remedies, its descriptions of anatomy, and its procedural guidance. Its instructions were copied and recopied, translated and adapted, spreading a corpus of practical knowledge that persisted long after the school of Salerno itself had faded from prominence. The creator or creators were lost to history, but their medical prescriptions lived on, actively helping to bring new life into the world and ease suffering for generations of women who never knew their names. Far to the west, in the rugged hills of Wales, a different king sought to build his legacy not with castles but with a code. Hywel Dda, known as Hywel the Good, understood that a kingdom's true strength lay in the clarity of its justice. He summoned the wisest men from every corner of his lands to a place called Tai Gwyn ar Daf, the White House on the Taff River. Their task was not to invent new laws, but to gather, debate, and finally commit to parchment the ancient customs and legal traditions of the Welsh people. The result was Cyfraith Hywel, the Law of Hywel, a comprehensive legal instruction that wove the fabric of daily life into a coherent system of rights and responsibilities. This was not a dry list of punishments. It was a detailed guide to living in a community, covering everything from the inheritance of farmland and the intricacies of contracts to the very specific value of a wild bee swarm or a proficient mouser. A cat that could hunt was worth 4 pence, the same as a newly weaned calf, because its service in protecting precious grain stores was vital to the household's survival. The laws meticulously defined the worth of every person, animal, and object, creating a stable economic and social order where everyone knew their place and their price. This deep cultural embeddedness is what gave Hywel's laws their incredible staying power. Even after Wales was conquered by England, these native instructions refused to die. For centuries, Welsh lawyers and local courts continued to use Cyfraith Hywel to settle disputes over land, marriage, and debt. It became a shield for Welsh identity, a written testament to a different way of organizing society that stood in quiet defiance of the imposing English common law. The kingdom of Hywel Dda was eventually absorbed by a more powerful neighbor, but his legal code endured, proving that the most resilient instructions are those that are woven into the very soul of a people, offering a form of cultural immortality long after the crown has turned to dust. Hidden away in a monastery's library was a craftsman's key to the entire material world. The Mappae Clavicula, its name meaning little key to the map, is a deceptively simple title for a book bursting with alchemical fire and vibrant color. Compiled around the 9th century, this was not a philosophical treatise. It was a working manual, a collection of hundreds of recipes for the hands that built and beautified the medieval landscape. Its pages contained precise formulas for creating the brilliant vermilion reds and azure blues that would illuminate sacred manuscripts. It gave instructions for mixing metal alloys to cast church bells that rang with a perfect tone, and for crafting the stained glass that turned sunlight into divine spectacle. Perhaps most intriguingly, it revealed the secrets for making counterfeit gems, teaching artisans how to use colored glass and resins to create dazzling jewels for those who could not afford the real thing. This was the shared knowledge of the workshop, the kind of practical magic usually passed from master to apprentice, now captured in ink for anyone with the skill to read it. The endurance of the Mappae Clavicula lies in its sheer utility. For over 600 years, its instructions were copied and recopied, traveling from one scriptorium to the next. An artist in a 10th century German monastery could follow the same recipe for gold leaf as a Renaissance painter in Florence preparing a masterpiece. An alchemist seeking to understand the properties of metals, or an early scientist probing the nature of materials, would find in its pages a foundational text of applied chemistry. It created an unbroken chain of technical knowledge, a continuous thread connecting the so-called Dark Ages to the brilliant dawn of the Renaissance. The anonymous compilers of this text understood that the survival of art and craft depended not just on inspiration, but on the precise, repeatable instructions for making the very tools of creation. They gave the future a key, and that key unlocked a world of color, light, and enduring beauty. A king's thirst for control could be measured in sheep and ploughlands. After his conquest of England, William I faced a monumental task. He possessed a kingdom, but he did not truly know it. To govern was to count, and so he unleashed an army of commissioners across the shires. Their royal instruction was breathtakingly simple and utterly revolutionary. Go to every hundred and every village, summon the local priests, the reeves, and 6 villagers from every settlement. Then ask them a relentless series of questions. Who held this land in the time of King Edward? Who holds it now? How many hides are there? How many plows? How many men? How much woodland, meadow, and pasture? How many mills and fish ponds? What was it worth then? What is it worth now? The sheer audacity of this survey was unprecedented. It was a systematic, property-by-property inventory of an entire nation, a snapshot of England frozen in time. The resulting volumes, so definitive they were nicknamed the Domesday Book as if their judgment was final, were indeed a record of staggering detail. But the greater legacy was the invisible instruction, the methodology itself. This was not a one-time accounting, it was the birth of a new model of power, centralized data collection as the ultimate tool of governance. The paradigm of sending out royal agents to methodically catalogue the wealth and resources of the land became a foundational concept for every state that followed. The tax rolls of medieval France, the land registries of early modern Europe, and even the very concept of a national census all trace a direct lineage back to those Norman commissioners and their lists. William sought only to maximize his own revenue and secure his throne, but the bureaucratic machine he set in motion would become an instruction for statecraft that governed long after his dynasty had faded into history. A master's secrets were not locked away in a vault, but carried in a worn leather satchel. The Sketchbook of Villard de Honnecourt is a window into the mind of a 13th century craftsman, a collection of over 250 pages bursting with life and practical genius. Here, a meticulously drawn lion sits beside the blueprint for a perpetual motion machine. Elaborate geometric diagrams share space with instructions for building a more efficient sawmill. This was not a personal diary, but a working man's encyclopedia, a portable university of design intended for the hands of fellow masons and architects. Villard traveled from one great construction site to another, from the rising cathedrals of Reims to the churches of Switzerland, and his sketchbook was his contribution to the collective intelligence of his craft. He drew everything he saw that was clever or beautiful, annotating his sketches with concise notes. "This is the lodge window from Reims," he would write, or "Here is how to make a screw without modern tools." The real power of his portfolio was its focus on the underlying principles, not just the finished forms. He broke down the most complex Gothic structures into their basic geometric components, showing how a series of simple squares and circles could generate the soaring elevation of a cathedral's facade. This was the core knowledge, the repeatable instruction that could be adapted to any site with any local stone. For generations after Villard laid down his pen, his sketchbook was copied and recirculated among the masons' guilds. A master builder in a distant town who would never know Villard's name could use his geometric tricks to solve a structural problem, or his detailed drawing of a trebuchet to design a new machine. The individual buildings Villard himself worked on have been lost to time, but his instructional sketches became embedded in the very DNA of Gothic architecture. His legacy was not a single stone laid upon another, but the invisible set of rules that taught others how to build their own wonders. The quiet hum of a monastery was often underscored by the rush of water. In the most remote valleys of 12th century Europe, the Cistercian monks did not just seek solitude, they engineered it. Their white-robed order turned wild landscapes into spiritual and industrial powerhouses, and their most critical partner in this transformation was the river itself. They became masters of hydraulics, and they meticulously wrote down everything they learned. Their technical manuals, a fusion of spiritual duty and practical genius, became the medieval world's definitive guide to harnessing water. These were not abstract theories. They were step-by-step instructions for building aqueducts that snaked for miles, for constructing massive water wheels that could power multiple mills in sequence, and for designing intricate networks of underground drains that kept their cloisters clean and dry. This was a complete system. The same channel that provided drinking water might first turn a millstone to grind grain, then flow into a fulling mill to pound cloth, and finally channel into a forge where it powered trip hammers for smelting iron. The Cistercians viewed this efficient use of God's creation as a form of worship, a way to make the wilderness fruitful. Their written knowledge became a coveted export. When a new monastery was founded, it was not just a matter of sending monks, but of sending the blueprints. These hydraulic instructions traveled from their heartland in France to the frontiers of Poland and the highlands of Scotland. A local lord, eager to profit from his lands, would often invite the Cistercians precisely for this expertise. They would arrive with their manuscripts and their practical know-how, and a barren valley would soon host a complex of mills and managed waterways that transformed the local economy. Long after the original engineers had passed away, their manuals continued to guide new projects. The principles of gradient and flow, the designs for sluice gates and mill races, all became embedded in the standard practice of European engineering. These monks did not just build for their own time, they wrote the instruction manual for water management that would flow uninterrupted for centuries to come. The longhouse fire cast flickering shadows on faces listening to the rhythm of an epic tale. In the cold isolation of medieval Iceland, the sagas were far more than entertainment. They were the living memory and the moral constitution of an entire people. Composed in the 13th and 14th centuries, these sprawling narratives of heroes, farmers, and outlaws were, in fact, a sophisticated set of societal instructions. They encoded a complete legal and ethical operating system within the framework of a compelling story. The sagas meticulously detailed the proper steps for conducting a blood feud, from the initial insult to the final arbitration at the National Assembly, the Althing. They showed how to bear witness in a court of law, what constituted valid evidence, and the severe consequences of perjury. A character's honor was not a vague concept, but a tangible asset, built through generosity, courage, and strict adherence to one's word. The stories illustrated, again and again, how breaking the unwritten codes of hospitality or kinship would inevitably lead to exile or death. This narrative method made the law accessible and unforgettable. Instead of a dry list of statutes, people absorbed the rules through the tragic fate of a hero who acted too rashly, or the triumphant justice secured by a clever farmer who used the legal process to outmaneuver a bully. The sagas taught generations how to navigate the complex web of allegiance and obligation that held their fragile society together. Long after the age of settlement passed into history, these narrative instructions continued to define what it meant to be Icelandic. They preserved a unique worldview, a specific way of resolving conflict and maintaining order, ensuring that the social fabric woven in those epic tales endured for centuries, long after the names of the storytellers who first spun them were lost to the wind. A physician in 13th century Paris and a surgeon in Naples could now open the same text and find the same definition for a fever or a fracture. The Alfita was more than a simple list of words. It was a master key designed to unlock a coherent body of medical knowledge across a fractured continent. Its compilers understood that for medicine to advance, a cough in England had to be understood as the same condition as a cough in Italy, described with the same precise terminology. This glossary provided the linguistic bedrock, meticulously pairing Latin terms with their Greek equivalents and offering clear, functional descriptions of diseases, symptoms, and hundreds of herbal remedies. It standardized the very vocabulary of healing, transforming a cacophony of local dialects into a unified language of science. This common tongue allowed a medical student at the University of Bologna to study texts from a Moorish physician in Spain because the core terms were defined and agreed upon. The Alfita's definitions became the invisible framework upon which centuries of medical learning were built, a set of instructions for clear communication that ensured knowledge could be accurately passed from one generation of healers to the next, long after the scholars who first penned those crucial definitions had vanished from memory. The sea was the final, fragile wall protecting an empire. While the Cistercians mastered rivers, the Byzantine Empire faced a far more formidable element, the open Mediterranean, where its very survival depended on a fleet of swift, deadly warships called dromons. On the deck of such a vessel, an admiral would not be relying on instinct alone. He carried with him a set of precise instructions, naval manuals like the Nommatia, that transformed a chaotic sea battle into a disciplined, calculable science. These texts were the empire's playbook for naval dominance. They detailed complex battle formations, crescent shapes to envelop an enemy fleet or a tight wedge to punch through its center, each movement coordinated by a sophisticated system of flags, lanterns, and drumbeats. But the most fearsome weapon in their arsenal, Greek fire, was also governed by strict procedural rules. The manuals contained the exact instructions for its deployment from pressurized siphons mounted on the ship's prow, a terrifying stream of liquid fire that could not be extinguished by water. This was not merely a weapon, it was a psychological tool, and its use was dictated by a doctrine designed to maximize its terror and tactical effect. The Byzantine fleet that once enforced these rules is long gone, its ships reclaimed by the sea, yet the strategic wisdom captured in those manuals refused to sink. When Venetian galleys patrolled the same waters or Ottoman admirals planned their campaigns, they studied the very same Byzantine texts, the principles of naval blockade, the tactics for fighting in confined straits, the entire concept of a coordinated fleet operating under a unified command and control system. These were the empire's true legacy. The instructions for ruling the waves, perfected to preserve a dying empire, became the foundational doctrine for every sea power that followed, a ghost fleet of ideas that sailed on for 1,000 years. A merchant in 14th century Florence could lose his entire fortune in a single bad transaction. The world of international trade was a web of immense risk, with shipments of silk and spice traveling for months across pirate-infested seas, their ultimate profit or loss a matter of agonizing uncertainty. To survive this volatile landscape, these Italian traders developed a revolutionary tool, a set of written instructions that brought mathematical clarity to the chaos of commerce. They called it the Libro di Ragione, the Book of Reason. Within its pages, every business venture was broken down into a simple yet profoundly powerful duality. For every value that entered the company, a corresponding value had to leave it. Every transaction was recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit. If you sold a bolt of cloth, your inventory of cloth decreased, but your chest of silver coins increased. The ledger had to balance always. This was double-entry bookkeeping, and it transformed guesswork into a precise science. The instructions within these books taught merchants not just to record what they owned, but to understand the very nature of their enterprise. They could now calculate their true profit, separate from their personal wealth. They could see which ventures were flourishing and which were draining their resources. This clarity allowed for unprecedented planning. A merchant could now confidently invest in a ship heading to Alexandria because his books showed him the exact state of his capital. This system of disciplined recording did more than protect individual fortunes. It built the architecture of the modern economic world. The ability to produce a balanced ledger created trust. Banks could assess creditworthiness. Silent partners could invest from afar, confident they could audit the books. This transparent, replicable method became the operational backbone for the first great banking houses and the earliest joint stock companies, entities that pooled capital from hundreds of investors to fund ventures no single person could afford. The specific merchants who penned those first Libri di Ragione are anonymous now, their personal ledgers long since crumbled to dust, but the instructional framework they perfected, the simple, relentless logic of debit and credit, escaped the pages of their account books to become the invisible, indispensable grammar of global capitalism. The outside world was a distant murmur through a single, high window. Inside a cell of stone, an anchoress lived a life of radical isolation, physically walled into a small room attached to a parish church. Her entire existence was a deliberate paradox, to be removed from society in order to better pray for its salvation. Guiding this profound solitude was a 13th century text of remarkable tenderness and psychological depth, the Ancren Wis, or the Anchoress's Guide. Its anonymous author understood that the greatest battle would not be against hunger or cold, but against the chaos of the mind itself. This was not a harsh list of punishments, but a compassionate rulebook for the soul's daily survival. It offered a meticulous schedule for prayer and readings, dividing the day and night into purposeful segments to stave off the dangers of idleness and despair. Yet its true genius lay in its insights into human nature. The text personified temptation as fierce, external foes, the world, the flesh, and the devil, but then gave the anchoress concrete mental tools to resist them. It taught her how to guard her thoughts, how to turn mundane chores into acts of devotion, and how to build an inner fortress of faith. Its instructions were so psychologically astute, its guidance so universally applicable to the inner life that its popularity exploded far beyond its original audience. Over the next 300 years, it was copied, adapted, and translated for monks, nuns, and even laypeople seeking a more disciplined spiritual existence. The Ancrenwis proved that the most enduring instructions are not always those that build empires or cathedrals, but those that teach a single human being how to construct a universe of meaning within the silence of their own heart. The silence of the anchor-hold gave way to the roaring fire and orchestrated chaos of a ducal kitchen. At the court of Amadeus VIII of Savoy, the master cook Chicquart faced a challenge as complex as any military campaign, to produce a feast that would stun the senses and proclaim his lord's power. In 1420, he committed his entire system to parchment in a work titled Du fait de cuisine on cookery. This was not a simple list of recipes, it was a complete operational manual for culinary warfare. Chicquart began with the kitchen itself, providing meticulous instructions for its layout. He designated separate stations for roasting, boiling, and baking, and specified the need for a dedicated pantry master to guard the spices, which were worth more than their weight in gold. His instructions covered the hiring and management of a small army of staff, from the head saucier to the lowliest scullion, each with a defined role in the grand production. Then came the dishes themselves, spectacular creations designed for visual drama as much as for taste. He detailed the process for roasting a whole stag, for serving a peacock redressed in its own iridescent feathers, and for presenting a swan seemingly floating on a lake of gilded pastry. This was edible theatre, and Chicquart was its master director. The true legacy of his book, however, was its role in professionalizing the culinary arts. It codified the standards of haute cuisine, transforming cooking from a domestic craft into a respected, systematic profession. His instructions for making a perfect sauce or for properly organizing a service became the foundational texts for other royal courts across Europe. The court of Savoy and Chicquart himself are distant memories, but the framework he established for grand dining, the very idea of a structured kitchen brigade and a multi-course menu, became the invisible architecture of fine cooking for centuries to follow. The scent of hot beeswax and freshly planed wood filled the workshop, a place governed by rules as tangible as the tools on the wall. For a master craftsman in a medieval city, his guild's ordinances were the unyielding framework of his daily life, a set of instructions that dictated everything from the purity of his silver to the number of years a young boy would spend sweeping his floors. These were not suggestions, they were binding regulations, meticulously written and sworn to by every member. A weaver's guild, for instance, would specify the exact number of threads per inch in a bolt of cloth, ensuring no member could undercut another by selling shoddy, loosely woven fabric. A silversmith's guild dictated the precise alloy of his metal, protecting the public from being cheated with cheap lead cores hidden beneath a thin veneer of silver. This was a system built on enforced trust, where the guild's collective reputation was the most valuable asset any craftsman possessed. To become a master, a young man would endure a long and rigidly defined apprenticeship, often 7 years or more, learning not just the skills of the trade but the ethical code that came with them. He was taught that a poorly made lock was not just a faulty product, it was a betrayal of the community's trust. The ordinances created a self-policing world where inspectors could visit any workshop, test the goods, and levy heavy fines or even expel a member for bringing dishonor upon the guild. This intricate web of professional instructions did far more than regulate local markets. It established the very idea that a product should have a verifiable standard of quality and that a craftsman should be formally certified as competent. The modern world still operates on this medieval principle. When you see a stamp on a piece of jewelry or a certification for an electrician, you are seeing the direct descendant of those guild ordinances. The individual masters who debated and wrote those rules are forgotten, but their foundational concept that quality and skill must be codified and guaranteed became the invisible blueprint for professional integrity that we still rely upon today. The guildsman's focus on a well-made lock gave order to life, but what instructions could possibly bring order to its final, inevitable moment? A new kind of manual emerged in the 15th century, born from the profound social trauma of the Black Death, and it was known as the Ars Moriendi, the art of dying. This was not a medical text but a spiritual one, a step-by-step guidebook for navigating the last great human transition. Its pages were filled with woodcut illustrations and clear, direct prose, offering prayers, meditations, and psychological strategies for confronting the final hour. It taught the dying person and those gathered around the bedside how to resist 5 specific temptations that were believed to assail the soul at the end: despair, impatience, spiritual pride, avarice, and an undue attachment to family and worldly things. Each temptation was met with a counter-argument, a prayer, or a comforting image of Christ's victory. This provided a practical script for a good death, transforming a chaotic, frightening event into a structured, meaningful ritual. The timing of its creation was everything. With the recent invention of the printing press, the Ars Moriendi became one of the first true bestsellers. Its instructions duplicated not in dozens of expensive manuscripts, but in thousands of affordable pamphlets and books. It escaped the control of the clergy and entered the homes of ordinary people, placed in family chests alongside deeds and marriage certificates, ready for the day it would be needed. For nearly 300 years, its words were whispered in sick rooms across Europe, offering a framework of solace and strength to generations who knew nothing of the anonymous theologians who first compiled it. It addressed the most universal and timeless of human needs, proving that the most enduring instructions are often those that do not teach us how to live better, but how to leave this life with a measure of peace and dignity. While the Ars Moriendi guided the soul's final journey, another set of instructions charted a path through the vibrant, living world. In the year 1160, a Jewish scholar named Benjamin left his home in Tudela, Spain, and began an epic 13-year pilgrimage across the known world. He was not a merchant or a conqueror, but a meticulous observer, and the book he eventually produced was a masterwork of practical navigation. His travelogue provided precise instructions for any merchant or pilgrim daring enough to follow in his footsteps. He did not just list the names of cities, he gave the exact distances between them, measured in days of travel. He described the condition of the roads, the locations of safe harbors, and the treacherous mountain passes where bandits might lie in wait. More than a simple itinerary, his work was a comprehensive guide to the human landscape. He detailed the political rulers of every region, the languages spoken, and the unique goods available in each market. A trader reading his book would learn that in Alexandria, one could find the finest pepper and silks from the east, while the markets of Constantinople offered luxurious furs from the Russian north. He meticulously documented the size and circumstances of Jewish communities from Provence to Baghdad, creating a vital network of potential hosts and trading partners for future travelers. Rabbi Benjamin returned to Spain and faded into history, but his instructions did not. For centuries, his travelogue was copied and recirculated, becoming an indispensable reference for anyone whose livelihood depended on crossing borders. A Genoese merchant planning a voyage to the Levant, or a scholar traveling to the great academies of the Middle East, would consult Benjamin's detailed accounts to understand the customs, costs, and dangers ahead. His personal journey was long over, but the roadmap he left behind continued to guide countless others, facilitating the flow of goods and ideas along the very routes he had walked, a testament to the enduring power of a well-documented path. A single, soaring melody could now be captured and held in the hand. Before the 11th century, music was a fleeting art, a beautiful ghost that lived only in the memory of the singer who carried it. A complex chant, learned over years by listening and repeating, was vulnerable to the slightest slip of memory or the death of a single elder. The sound itself was ephemeral, impossible to archive. Then, in a monastery choir in Arezzo, a Benedictine monk named Guido faced this very problem, his young novices struggling for years to master the vast repertoire of Gregorian chant. His solution was an instruction so elegant it would change the nature of sound itself. Guido gave music a permanent home on the page. He perfected the use of a 4-line staff, a grid that could precisely plot the rise and fall of a pitch. A note placed on the second line had a fixed identity, different from a note in the space just above it. This was the birth of precise musical literacy. But Guido went further, creating a teaching tool that is still sung in classrooms today. He took a familiar hymn to St. John and noticed that each successive line began on a higher note. He assigned a syllable to each of these first 6 notes: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. These solfege syllables gave each tone a name, a unique personality a student could grasp and remember. Now, a novice could look at a series of notes on the staff and sing the corresponding melody on sight: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, without ever having heard it before. He detailed this revolutionary system in his instructional manual, the Micrologus. This was not just a new way to learn music, it was a new way to think about it. Music was no longer bound to the throat of a living master. It could be written down with perfect accuracy, sent across continents, and studied by composers who could now build upon the work of others, layering harmonies and constructing symphonies of previously unimaginable complexity. The simple act of assigning a note to a line and giving it a name broke the chains of the oral tradition. Every piece of sheet music you have ever seen, from a child's piano book to the full score of a Beethoven symphony, exists because of Guido's foundational instructions. The monk who only sought to teach his boys to sing on pitch ultimately gave the world a universal language for beauty, an instruction for preserving sound that has echoed for a full millennium. A noble's glove was not just a piece of leather, but a stage for a partnership between human and wild instinct. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, was obsessed with this intricate dance, and his monumental work on the art of hunting with birds is a testament to that obsession. This was no simple hobbyist's guide. It was a scientific and philosophical exploration, an instruction manual of staggering depth compiled by one of the most powerful men in the world. Frederick rejected the old, superstitious texts of his time. He insisted on direct observation, on understanding the hawk not as a symbol, but as a living creature with its own nature and intelligence. His treatise provided meticulous, step-by-step instructions for every phase of the relationship. It detailed how to select a young bird from the nest, how to patiently man it, which meant acclimating it to human presence, and how to train it to return to the feast through a system of rewards with fresh meat. The instructions covered the construction of proper mews, the diagnosis and treatment of avian illnesses, and the precise techniques for flying the bird at prey, from partridges to cranes. The emperor's methods were so advanced, his observations of bird behavior so accurate, that they formed the bedrock of falconry for the next 500 years. Royal courts from England to Persia treated his book as the ultimate authority. A French countess or an Arab emir could follow the exact same training regimen, creating a shared aristocratic language that transcended war and religion. The empire Frederick ruled is gone, but his instructions for forging a bond with a raptor refused to fade. They ensured that the art of falconry, this living heritage of the hunt, would soar far beyond the lifetime of the emperor who so loved the chase. Frederick II's falconry manual celebrated a partnership with the wild, but another set of instructions sought the opposite, a complete retreat from the world's distractions. In the misty valleys of the French Alps, a man named Bruno of Cologne founded a new kind of monastery, and the rules he and his followers wrote became the Carthusian Statutes. These were not gentle guidelines, they were a rigorous constitution for a life of radical silence. The statutes dictated an existence of almost unimaginable austerity, where monks lived as hermits in individual cells that formed a communal village. Each cell was a small house with its own garden, workshop, and a covered walkway that allowed the monk to move to the church for prayers without encountering another human soul. The core instruction was a vow of near-perpetual silence, broken only for essential liturgical prayers sung together, and a single weekly communal walk. This was not a punishment, but a deliberate path to a different kind of awareness, a way to empty the mind of worldly chatter to make room for a direct, unmediated experience of the divine. The genius of these statutes was their profound understanding of human psychology and sustainability. The rule balanced absolute solitude with just enough structure to prevent madness or despair. The monks supported themselves through their own labor in their gardens and workshops, copying manuscripts or crafting simple goods, creating a cycle of self-sufficiency that made the community resilient to external economic shocks. This perfect, delicate balance is why the Carthusian way of life has endured, virtually unaltered, for more than 800 years. It survived the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII and the secularizing forces of the French Revolution because its foundational principle was so pure and self-contained. In a world of constant noise and connection, the Carthusian Statutes stand as a quiet, unyielding monument to a different kind of human instruction, one that teaches us how to listen to the profound silence within. The first longship crunched onto the black sand of an empty Icelandic bay, its dragon-head prow scanning a landscape of fire and ice. For the Norse families who stepped ashore, this was the ultimate gamble, a chance to carve a new world from raw wilderness. Centuries later, their descendants sought to preserve the memory of this daring experiment, compiling the Landnámabók, a book that did far more than record history. It became a permanent instruction manual for building a society from nothing. This text meticulously chronicled the settlement of Iceland, naming the 400 original land takers and mapping their claims with the precision of a modern land registry. It was a guide written in the language of precedent, showing future generations exactly how their ancestors had claimed a fjord, divided a valley, or established the boundaries of a farmstead based on natural landmarks. The book taught the unwritten rules of colonization, how a chieftain should claim a large coastal area for himself and his followers, and how later arrivals could negotiate for inland parcels. It was a masterclass in social geography, encoding the complex hierarchy of a new colony into the very names of the mountains and rivers. For hundreds of years, if two Icelandic farmers disputed a pasture, they did not simply fight over it. They went to the local assembly and consulted the Landnámabók, its ancient accounts of who first built a homestead where, and whose sheep first grazed on which hillside, served as the ultimate legal authority. It settled inheritance disputes by tracing a family's lineage directly back to a founding settler, proving their rightful claim to the land. This single book effectively governed the distribution and ownership of property long after the age of settlement was a distant memory. The original settlers, whose names fill its pages, could never have known that their personal stories of survival would become the binding constitution for an entire nation, a set of instructions for belonging that was written not in laws, but in the land itself. A prayer could be more than a plea for salvation. It could be a tool for sculpting the mind. The Ars Notoria, or the notary art, was a medieval manual of a very different kind, one that promised its user not eternal life, but a perfect memory and instant mastery of the 7 liberal arts. Its instructions were a complex fusion of piety and cognitive science, involving intricate sequences of prayers to be recited at specific astrological hours, accompanied by the intense contemplation of complex diagrams filled with symbols and divine names. The practitioner believed that by focusing their entire being on these sacred images and words, the knowledge of grammar, rhetoric, and logic would be directly infused into their soul, bypassing years of tedious study. This was not mere superstition, but a reflection of a profound medieval belief that the mind was a holy instrument, capable of almost limitless expansion through disciplined spiritual practice. While the Church would later view such texts with deep suspicion, branding them as esoteric magic, the core objective of the Ars Notoria was a timeless human pursuit, the enhancement of our own mental faculties. Its methods, though wrapped in mystical language, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the power of visualization and structured repetition as keys to unlocking memory. This quest for cognitive improvement refused to die with the Middle Ages. The same principles of using vivid mental images and organized spatial layouts to store information resurfaced in the memory theaters of Renaissance scholars. A philosopher like Giulio Camillo would design elaborate imaginary buildings, placing concepts and speeches in specific rooms to be retrieved at will, a direct descendant of the Ars Notoria's visual approach. The creators of these medieval memory instructions are anonymous, their prayers largely forgotten, yet their central idea that the human mind can be trained, systematized, and radically improved through deliberate technique escaped the page to fuel a revolution in learning, proving that the desire to upgrade our own intelligence is an instruction that has never gone out of date. A fortress wall stood as the ultimate test of an army's ingenuity. While the Ars Notoria sought to unlock the mind, Byzantine military engineers were perfecting the art of unlocking the most stubborn stone defenses. Their knowledge was crystallized in technical manuals like the Parangil Mater Poliasetica, a comprehensive guide to the brutal science of siegecraft. These were not vague strategic doctrines, but step-by-step instructions for building colossal machines of war. A commander could follow the text to construct a trebuchet, learning the precise ratios for its counterweight and throwing arm to maximize the force of its impact. The manuals detailed the assembly of massive battering rams, suspended within reinforced sheds to protect the crews swinging them against iron-shod gates. They provided blueprints for mobile siege towers, multi-story wooden behemoths on wheels, complete with instructions for their protective wet hides to shield against fire arrows and the drawbridges that would drop their soldiers onto the enemy's ramparts. This was engineering data applied to the problem of breaking a city's will. The true legacy of these texts, however, was their relentless migration across cultures and centuries. When Western knights encountered the formidable defenses of the Middle East during the Crusades, they quickly realized their own siege techniques were primitive by comparison. They eagerly adopted and adapted the Byzantine formulas, translating the manuals and applying their principles to breach castles from the Holy Land to the Welsh marches. The knowledge traveled in the other direction as well, with Ottoman armies studying these very same texts to perfect their own artillery and ultimately breach the legendary walls of Constantinople itself. The Byzantine Empire that first compiled this knowledge is dust, but its instructions for conquest refused to die. They became the shared, brutal language of medieval warfare, a ghost in the machine of every castle that fell and every new fortress that was built to withstand the very engines these manuals had taught the world to build. A lord's power was not only measured in knights and castles, but in bushels of wheat and days of labor owed. The true engine of the medieval economy was the manor, a self-contained world where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and by a crucial written instruction known as the Costumal. This was the operating manual for the entire estate, a detailed record that spelled out the intricate web of obligations binding the lord to his peasants. It meticulously listed the annual rent a tenant owed for his strip of land, often payable in chickens, eggs, or sacks of grain. More importantly, it recorded the exact number of days each week a peasant was required to labor on the lord's own demesne lands, plowing, harvesting, or mending fences. But this was not a one-sided document of exploitation. The Costumal also enshrined the tenant's rights, guaranteeing his access to the common pasture for his cow, his share of firewood from the lord's forest, and the protection of the manorial court. This created a system of mutual, if unequal, dependency. The genius of the Costumal was its role as a living constitution. When a new lord inherited the estate or a new steward was appointed, they did not simply impose their will. They consulted the Costumal. Its written precedents created stability and predictability for everyone. A peasant knew precisely what was expected of him, and the lord knew the limits of his own demands. This prevented the kind of arbitrary rule that could spark rebellion or cause families to flee. For generations, these documents settled disputes over how much a widow owed after her husband's death, or whether a farmer's son could inherit the family tenement. The original lords who commissioned these records and the stewards who first wrote them are utterly forgotten. Yet the economic and legal relationships they codified became the enduring fabric of rural life for centuries. Long after the feudal system itself had withered away, the patterns of land tenure and local governance established in these customals persisted, a quiet testament to the power of a written rule to bring order to the daily struggle for bread and belonging. The red ink was a command. In the quiet of a sacristy, a priest preparing for Mass would open his most important book, the Missal, and there he found his every movement choreographed. Scattered across its vellum pages, written in a distinctive crimson script, were the rubrics. These were not the prayers themselves, but the stage directions for the entire sacred drama. They told him exactly when to elevate the host, how many steps to take from the altar to the lectern, the precise angle of a bow, and the specific tone of voice for each spoken word. This was the ultimate set of performative instructions, designed to remove personal whim and create a perfect, repeatable ritual. A Mass celebrated in a rural English parish was meant to be identical in its essential form to one offered in a Roman basilica or a German cathedral city. This liturgical uniformity created a powerful, invisible unity. A traveling merchant or a pilgrim could walk into any church in Latin Christendom and, despite the foreign language, recognize the familiar rhythm of the service. The rising incense, the ringing of the small bell at the consecration, the sight of the priest raising the Eucharist, all these sensory cues were synchronized by the rubrics to trigger a shared emotional and spiritual response. This common experience became the bedrock of Western Christian identity for centuries. Even when the Protestant Reformation shattered the religious unity of Europe, the basic structure embedded in those medieval rubrics proved incredibly resilient. The Reformers stripped away much of the ceremony, but the core sequence of confession, scripture reading, sermon, and communion remained. The liturgical framework, established by those anonymous red ink instructions, had become so deeply ingrained that it shaped the very architecture of worship for both Catholic and Protestant traditions alike, a testament to the enduring power of a perfectly designed ritual. A splash of crimson and gold on a shield was more than decoration, it was a shout in the chaos of battle. From the 12th century onward, the battlefield became a canvas of identity, where a fully armored knight could be instantly recognized not by his face, but by the symbols blazoned across his surcoat and banner. Governing this vibrant visual language was a strict set of instructions known as Heraldic Ordinances. These were the unbreakable grammatical rules for a code of color and shape. The ordinances dictated everything with meticulous precision. They specified the two core types of colors, the vibrant tinctures like gules, red and azure, blue, and the metallic fields of ore, gold and argent, silver. A fundamental rule, the so-called rule of tincture, forbade placing a color on a color or a metal on a metal, ensuring the design remained starkly visible from 100 yards away. The system assigned profound meaning to a menagerie of symbols. A lion, rampant on its hind legs, signaled courage and royalty. An eagle represented power and authority, while a simple tower could denote strength and defensive capability. Every line, every partition of the shield, every tiny mark known as a cadency mark to differentiate a first son from a fourth, was governed by this written code. This was not art for art's sake. It was a functional, life-saving identification system that evolved into a sophisticated language of lineage. The true power of these ordinances was their transformation of a practical battlefield tool into a permanent legal and social document. A coat of arms, once granted and recorded in a herald's roll, became the immutable property of a family, a trademark of bloodline that was passed down through generations. Long after plate armor was retired and the tournament field fell silent, these symbolic instructions refused to fade. They migrated from shields to wax seals on legal documents, to the carved stone above a manor house door, and to the silverware on a noble table. Today, cities, universities, and even corporations use the principles of heraldry in their logos and insignia, a direct inheritance from those medieval rulebooks. The heralds who first penned those ordinances are nameless now, but the language they codified continues to speak, a vibrant whisper of identity from an age when a man was known by the symbols he carried into the fray. Deep beneath the cobbled streets of Iglau, the true sound of wealth was the constant drip of water and the rhythmic strike of a pick against silver-bearing rock. In the 13th century, this booming mining town developed something as revolutionary as the precious metal it produced, a comprehensive legal code written specifically for the men who worked in the depths. The Iglau Mining Law was not a simple list of rules from a distant lord. It was a sophisticated constitution for an underground society, a complete instruction that acknowledged the unique dangers and demands of the miner's life. It granted miners personal freedoms unheard of for most medieval laborers, including the right to leave their employment and move to another mine if they were dissatisfied. It established a share system for the ore they extracted, turning them from mere workers into stakeholders with a direct interest in the mine's success. The code meticulously outlined safety protocols, dictating the proper way to shore up tunnels with timber to prevent collapses and procedures for managing the ever-present threat of flooding. Most remarkably, it created a specialized mining court, a tribunal of experienced miners who alone understood the technicalities of their craft and could deliver fair judgments on disputes over claim boundaries, theft of ore, or negligence. This legal framework proved so brilliantly effective and fair that its instructions refused to stay in Iglau. The code was copied, translated, and adopted by mining towns from the Erzgebirge Mountains to the depths of Transylvania. For over 400 years, it governed the most critical industry in Central Europe, creating a common legal language for resource extraction that balanced the relentless pursuit of profit with the fundamental need to protect the lives and rights of those who did the digging. The anonymous authors of this code are lost to history, but their principles of fair labor practice and specialized justice became the bedrock for mining law across a continent, proving that the most enduring instructions are often those forged in the darkest, most demanding places. The final step on our journey is not a castle or a code of law, but a well-worn path stretching across a continent. For over 800 years, the road to Santiago de Compostela has drawn millions of travelers, all following a single, indispensable guide. The 12th century Codex Calixtinus was the ultimate pilgrim's manual, a comprehensive instruction for both body and soul. Its pages offered starkly practical advice that meant the difference between life and death on the long road. It detailed the safest routes through the Pyrenees, marked the locations of reliable wells and hospices where one could find shelter, and bluntly warned of treacherous river crossings and the local lords known to charge extortionate tolls. This was vital intelligence passed from one pilgrim to the next, now preserved in ink. But the Codex was far more than a map. It wove the physical landscape with a tapestry of divine wonder, recounting vivid stories of miracles performed by Saint James and the sacred history of the shrines along the way. A pilgrim resting by a roadside cross would read of a vision that had occurred on that very spot, transforming a simple break into a moment of profound connection. This brilliant combination of earthly guidance and spiritual law standardized the entire pilgrimage experience. A traveler from Germany and another from Portugal could share the same expectations, follow the same rituals at the same churches, and feel part of a single, flowing river of faith. The original authors and compilers of the Codex Calixtinus are anonymous, their personal journeys long complete, yet their instructions refused to fade into history. In our own time, this medieval guide has been rediscovered, reprinted, and downloaded onto smartphones. Modern walkers, whether seeking spiritual meaning or a physical challenge, still follow the routes it laid out, sleep in towns it recommended, and are captivated by the very same legends. The book ensured that the Camino was not just a memory, but a living, breathing pathway. It gave the world an instruction for a different kind of travel, one where the journey itself, step by deliberate step, becomes the destination. These 30 instructions, from the monastic rule to the pilgrim's guide, all share a secret recipe for immortality. They were not merely clever ideas, they were solutions to problems that humanity could never fully escape. Each one addressed a deep and persistent need: how to govern justly, how to heal the sick, how to build a community, or how to find meaning in life and death. Their utility was their anchor, tethering them to the real world long after more abstract philosophies had faded away. But a useful idea can still be forgotten if it has no one to carry it forward. This is where the second thread appears, the power of a resilient institution. The rule of Saint Benedict found its vessel in the global network of the Catholic Church. The guild ordinances were enforced by the enduring structure of the craft guilds themselves. These were not fleeting organizations. They were self-perpetuating systems with a vested interest in preserving their own operational knowledge. They became arks built to weather the storms of centuries, ensuring that the instructions they carried were copied, taught, and put into practice generation after generation. Yet rigidity can be a coffin. The third thread is perhaps the most surprising: their inherent adaptability. The plan of St. Gall was a perfect blueprint that was never built exactly as drawn, yet its principles of organized space were adapted for countless real-world monasteries and towns. The Byzantine naval manuals were studied by both their enemies and their successors. their tactics reinterpreted for new ships and new weapons. These instructions were like master keys, capable of unlocking similar problems in vastly different eras because they focused on underlying principles rather than rigid, context-specific details. They were frameworks, not cages. This brings us to the final and most profound commonality. These instructions resonated because they touched upon something elemental in the human experience. The Ars Moriendi did not just teach people how to die. It addressed the universal fear of the unknown and the deep need for dignity in our final moments. The customals of the manor did not just record rents. They codified the eternal human struggle for security, belonging, and a fair relationship with authority. They captured fundamental truths about who we are, what we fear, and what we hope for. That is the ultimate lesson in longevity. An idea becomes immortal not when it is perfectly preserved like a fossil, but when it remains a living, breathing part of the human story, answering questions that every generation finds itself asking anew. The quiet dedication of a scribe, the bold decree of an emperor, and the careful sketch of a master builder all converged on a single, profound truth. A powerful idea, once entrusted to a lasting medium, can achieve a kind of immortality. These 30 instructions are far more than brittle relics in a museum case. They are living testaments to the ingenuity of the medieval mind, a vibrant chorus of solutions that still echo in the architecture of our cities, the principles of our laws, and the very ways we seek meaning and order. They solved fundamental human problems with a clarity that transcended their own time, building frameworks for governance, advancing the art of healing, structuring faith, and perfecting craft in ways that continue to inform our modern world. This legacy asks a compelling question of us today. What we create, our own laws, technologies, and most enduring stories, carries the same potential to speak to generations we will never meet. The whispers from these medieval scribes and visionaries urge us to consider what knowledge we are crafting, what instructions we are writing for the future. Let their enduring legacy inspire you to think about the mark your own understanding might leave on the long timeline of human history. If this journey through time has offered you a new perspective, consider subscribing for more explorations into history's hidden treasures. We would love to hear which of these medieval instructions you find most fascinating, so share your thoughts in the comments.